there is an expression that we probably all are familiar with, and that is, don't jump to conclusions. We've all heard that expression. Don't jump to conclusions, and it means don't look at appearances or the way a situation looks and immediately decide what it means. It means don't judge a situation prematurely. How often do we assume that something is seriously wrong when it turns out to be nothing at all? We can save ourselves a lot of anxiety and a lot of grief by not jumping to conclusions, because at times we then become so upset about the situation that it turns out to be nothing at all. We are creatures with 5 physical senses, and God created us that way so we can operate in the natural world. We use our taste, our sight, our hearing, and so forth, our touch, to gather information. But there are also other unseen factors. We need to wait at times and open the eyes of our faith and the ears of our faith to really hear what God is saying to us in the midst of a situation, and not just judging by what we see or hear. It's funny because I was already planning this worship service this week and looking at scriptures and so forth and about overcoming faith. And we had a situation in the office this very week that kind of challenged that, brought it to light. It's a really good example. Suddenly, the printer in the secretary's office just stopped printing. It was working fine the day before, and then it wasn't working. And so immediately our minds leap to all kinds of conclusions. Oh, it could be serious problems. Oh, it could be something wrong with the printer. Oh, what are we going to do? We have to, all these things that have to be printed for the week, and how's it going to happen? Well, it turned out to be nothing more than just a loose connection on one of the cords. And when that was put back in, it was fine, and it worked perfectly well. We actually we called the people that do the printer, the advanced printer, and he came out and he just laughed at us. Good thing is we're under contract. He says, did you check the cords? So 2 seconds, he took care of it. And we were like, all our anxiety for nothing, And if we'd been, thinking, maybe we might have figured that out, but for next time we'll know. The enemy will take advantage of us. The enemy will take advantage of our perceptions to try to influence us or create an alarm in the midst of situations. And he is so good at almost exaggerating things, where it almost seems worse than it really is. And all of the thoughts of, oh no, what if this and what if that? And, we make all these conclusions. But we have to be strong against that. We have to learn to recognize those deceptions, to recognize the attempts of the enemy to get us down the wrong path and get us discouraged, and to walk by faith. Paul says we walk by faith and not by sight. The things around us are always changing. They'll always be presenting this or that before our eyes, but we are not to be looking at those things. We are to be looking at God and trusting in God in the midst of even things that may seem to be really amiss or awry. And so we have to be sure that we don't let the enemy deceive us. And that is one of the first steps of overcoming faith, is not leaping to conclusions. There's a very good biblical example of this in the Old Testament that happened to Jacob, who was the father of 12 sons, if you remember, and his most beloved son was the son Joseph. And he gave this young son a multicolored coat because he favored him above all the other sons. Well, Joseph's brothers were very jealous of Joseph, and so they took Joseph one day and they threw him in a pit, and then they sold him as a slave to a caravan. There was some talk about maybe killing him, but they got a little too squeamish to do that, so they just ended up selling him as a slave to a passing caravan. And then they took the multicolored coat and they sprinkled it with some animal's blood and brought it to their father, laid it before him and said, "Is this your son's coat?" Well, Jacob, immediately on seeing this coat covered in blood, he just leapt to conclusions, to the very worst conclusions that he could, by the evidence of his eyes. And he assumed just exactly what those brothers wanted. He assumed that Joseph had been killed, and he went into deep mourning for many, many, many years, just on the evidence of that coat. Now just imagine what might have happened if Jacob had questioned the evidence. Just imagine if he said, "You know, God has always been with me. God watches over my family. I'm going to institute a search and just find out more. See if anybody saw my son." Well, if he did do that, it's quite possible that someone might have known what had happened to Joseph. He might have been able to find him. If he turned to God for God's help and trusted in God and just said, "Wait a minute, I'm not going to assume the worst here," it's possible that he might have found Joseph. But what Jacob did was he gave up hope. So he jumped to conclusions, and then the second thing is he gave up hope. And so that's another aspect of overcoming faith. It's never, ever give up hope. Always keep on believing God and don't give up. And so he really had to suffer all of that loss and grief unnecessarily, but of course in the end God restored, which was good. When we're confronted by situations that seem to say, "Oh, all is lost," that is not the time for us to give up our faith or throw in the towel, as they say. It could be that as we keep trusting in God, the victory will be just right around the corner. So how we do this is, first of all, to get our eyes off those circumstances. Stop looking at the things that are presented there, or the evil report, or whatever it may be, and get our eyes back on God. Begin looking at God, begin looking in God's Word. If we continue to see the circumstances, our eyes are fixed on what's really darkness. But when we look to God, light will come on us. When we begin to receive God's Word, then it will minister peace to us and light to us and hope to us. Paul puts it this way. He says, "We fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what's unseen." And Paul's a wonderful example of someone who never ever gave up and continued to carry out the ministry God had given him despite tremendous opposition, when he could have so often given up. Especially things like the shipwreck, he could have said, "That's it, all is lost." But no, Paul always kept his eyes on God. What Paul goes on to say is, what is seen is temporary. What is unseen is eternal. It helps a lot to remind yourself it's temporary. It's subject to change. This situation I'm in, this situation of not having a job, it's subject to change. God can change this. Whatever it might be, the situation in my family or with my child, or it's subject to change. God can change this. Because the truth is that everything is, as Paul says, what we see is temporary, temporal, and it can change. But when we look at God's eternal kingdom, that is the thing that has the power to change the seen realm. The unseen can change the seen. And so then we need to have our eyes focused on God and look through the eyes of faith. Peter was a man who really desired to walk by faith. And I kind of admire Peter, even though he certainly flubbed it and blew it quite a few times. But he had a certain boldness to his faith that I think is commendable. You think of the situation that one day when he and the disciples were out on the